So you probably heard about former Vice President Joe Biden bluntly invoking his Democratic primary victory over independent Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders when he was asked to allay Wisconsin voters' alleged worries about socialism, saying, "I beat the socialist." Well, I just found this new website called Socialist Alternative. Socialist Alternative is the organization that spearheaded the campaign to elect Kshama Sawant to Seattle City Council in 2013, the first independent socialist elected in a major U.S. city in decades. So not only did Biden beat the socialist, Bernie Sanders, he beat all of the socialists. But wait a minute, maybe the socialists will have the last word. If voting doesn't actually do anything, maybe the socialists will kick Biden's ass some other way. This article from their website is called Harm Reduction Voting versus Independent Working Class Politics by George Martin Fell Brown. Millions have spent the past 4 years horrified by the experience of the increasingly authoritarian Trump administration that deliberately stokes racist division. But many are nonetheless disappointed that his main opponent, Joe Biden, is a corporate tool who was an architect of mass incarceration and whose campaign message boils down to, "I'm not Trump." Socialist Alternative is supporting Howie Hawkins, a candidate for the Green Party with a left program, and we're doing so in order to rally support for a new party. Many left activists are nonetheless advocating a vote for Biden. Sanders himself has been attempting to sell Biden, saying he will be the most progressive president since FDR. Others, such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, have been more willing to admit to Biden's failures, framing her endorsement of him as harm reduction. The idea of voting as harm reduction has become increasingly popular among activist circles since the 2016 election. It has a certain following within the Democratic Socialists of America. It's especially popular among anarchist and base-building trends on the left who traditionally look down on electoral politics. In practice, however, the harm reduction argument is far less radical than its rhetoric would have you believe. This is me speaking. We've already talked about Democratic Socialists of America being weak tea. Their Bernie or bust resolution was anything but. And the old guard of DSA is definitely weak tea. But back to the story. What is harm reduction? The term harm reduction has its origins in public health rather than electoral politics. Developed during the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, it was a progressive challenge to the war on drugs. While the war on drugs pretended to be about saving people from the scourge of drug addiction, it failed in this task but succeeded in strengthening institutionalized racism. The harm reduction approach, on the other hand, accepted the reality of drug use and sought to provide services that would mitigate the worst effects of drug addiction. Most notably, this involved setting up needle exchange programs that could provide heroin addicts with clean needles, which could prevent the spread of HIV. When the term is used in electoral politics, it means voting for Democrats as a means of preventing Republicans from coming to power. But supporting corporate parties and politicians is fundamentally different from providing a social service for people struggling with addiction. The embrace of harm reduction in an electoral context is less an attempt to expand the harm reduction principle than an attempt to give lesser evilism a makeover. After all, saying you support lesser evilism sounds like you're compromising your ideals. But saying you support harm reduction sounds like you're taking a stand against institutionalized racism and state repression. Vosh the sheepdog, are you listening to this argument? Regardless of which term you use, the actual practice fails to live up to the name. Lesser evilism, or harm reduction, relies on viewing individual elections in isolation, tallying up the pros and cons of two candidates. But actual change is the product of mass social struggle in the streets and in the workplaces. The struggles of the late 60s and early 70s brought about fundamental gains in women's rights, civil rights, labor rights, and expanded social services, even under the right-wing Republican President Richard Nixon. The Democratic Party, an institution of big business, plays the role of the graveyard of social movements. serving to derail social struggles from the Wisconsin uprising of 2011 to the fight for Medicare for all to the Me Too movement. In office, Obama didn't cause harm reduction, but harm creation on a massive scale. Obama bailed out banks and auto companies on the backs of workers, deported more people than any other president, cracked down on whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, and continued the war in Afghanistan while massively expanding drone warfare. Even if one claims that this was harm reduction in comparison with a hypothetical Republican administration, helping Wall Street while doing nothing for millions who lost their jobs and homes during the 2008-2009 recession allowed assorted right-wing demagogues from Ron Paul to the Tea Party to Donald Trump to portray themselves as anti-establishment. This helped to bring Trump to power, bringing about the very harm that voting Democrat was supposed to reduce. In the 2016 and 2020 elections, Bernie Sanders was able to provide a voice for the struggles that had broken out, but he was constrained by working within the big business Democratic Party, including his lesser evil support for Clinton and Biden following the primaries. Socialist Alternative supported Sanders' campaigns in 2016 and 2020 in part because they pointed in the direction of a new party, but we also warned about the dangers of remaining within the framework of the Democratic Party. Oh, that we had heeded those warnings. In 2016, when Sanders ended his campaign and supported Clinton, he in effect demobilized a left political force that could have played a crucial role going into the Trump years. His campaign could have been the beginning of a new party and would have made the fight against the right far more effective. Likewise, his capitulation this time has left working people facing a leadership vacuum in the middle of the pandemic and economic crisis. This is real harm creation. Anarchists who vote. There are some differences, however, between the harm reduction argument and the traditional lesser evil argument. Traditional advocates of lesser evilism tend to overstate the role of electoral politics at the expense of social struggle as the driving force of social change. Advocates of harm reduction, on the other hand, do acknowledge the primary role of social struggle and, if anything, downplay the significance of electoral politics. Keaton Weiss, are you listening to this argument? One of the most prominent pieces on the harm reduction approach to elections was a 2016 Truth Out article by anarchist Ryan Conrad called "I Am an Anarchist and I Vote. I Am a Sheepdog and I Vote." In this article, it wasn't simply voting for Democrats that was portrayed as harm reduction, but electoral politics in general. Conrad refused to encourage electoral politics beyond harm reduction voting, and instead reduced voting to one of many small strategies to make another world possible, effectively a side activity to accompany the real struggle in the streets. A more caustic version of this argument came from Jezebel writer Esther Wang in the current election. After Bernie Sanders endorsed Biden, Wang expressed support for the decision because I'm not a dummy who thinks electoral politics is anything but harm reduction. Not a dummy. Same way Vosh is not a dummy. Same way Nick Brana is not a dummy, if you think about it. Yes, this is a caustic argument. Back to the story. This attitude is an attempt to reconcile radical politics with support for corporate politicians. If anything, building independent working class politics is presented as sowing reformist illusions like a dummy, and voting for a candidate as worthless as Joe Biden is a way to show off the revolutionary contempt you hold for the bourgeois electoral system. This line of argument predates the electoral use of the term harm reduction. In the 2004 presidential election, the anarchist intellectual Noam Chomsky advocated support for pro-war Democrat John Kerry on this basis. Chomsky argued that elections were a marginal part of politics that amounted to spending 5 minutes maybe thinking about what you should do. As Socialist Alternative argued at the time, the electoral system is not a marginal part of politics. While elections under capitalism are rigged in favor of big business, they nonetheless bring millions of working class people into political activity. The ultra-left anarchist dismissal of electoral politics serves to cede that intense political activity to big business. This is even more true when it's accompanied by engaging in electoral politics on a harm reduction basis. Keaton, you should come back on the show and we should discuss this article. Independent working class politics. The potential for a genuinely revolutionary approach to electoral politics can be seen through the example of Kshama Sawant, Socialist Alternative City Council member in Seattle. When she was first elected in 2013, Sawant and Socialist Alternative were under no illusions that progress could simply be legislated into existence. Recognizing these limitations, we used our elected city council position to mobilize the working class into activity and to expose the corporate domination of local politics. This allowed us to achieve major victories, from the $15 an hour minimum wage in 2014 to the recent Amazon tax, a tax on big business generating an estimated $210 to $240 million per year to build social housing. These victories were accomplished against massive opposition from big business and with a minority of one on the city council. Kshama has won 3 elections, the most recent of which saw Amazon pour over $1 million into defeating her. Combating this required massive mobilization and organization efforts that played directly into our extra electoral campaigning. It was not a marginal part of Seattle politics limited to spending 5 minutes maybe thinking about what you should do. The opportunity is there to replicate the experience of Seattle on a much larger scale. Bernie Sanders' campaigns in 2016 and 2020 served as a massive pole of attraction for working people. Had he been willing to break from the Democratic Party, he could have directed that energy in the direction of building a new working class party on a national scale. The same role could be played by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Democratic Socialists of America. Building a genuine political voice for working people would accomplish much more than mere harm reduction. However, lining up behind Biden or Clinton, Obama, and Kerry before him serves to stifle this move. So Biden's slap in the face against Bernie, "I beat the socialist," maybe that will inflame socialists everywhere to rise up and beat Biden's ass. Everyone absolutely should tweet this article to Vosh the sheepdog. As usual, I will link to this article under both the video and the podcast. And if any doubts remain that Joe Biden intended what he said as a slap in the face to Bernie, we turn to Caitlin Johnstone's article, "Why Liberals Hate Leftists." Liberals hate leftists. Hate them, hate them, hate them. They don't often admit it, of course. Admitting you hate those to your left at least as much as you hate those to your right would cause a lot of cognitive dissonance for those who think of themselves as being on the left, and it would weaken their arguments considerably. But they do. Liberals hate leftists for a number of reasons. Liberals hate leftists because there is a night and day difference between a capitalist, imperialist establishment and an ideology which wants to tear down that establishment and replace it with peace and socialism. There's more of a difference between true leftists and establishment liberals than there is between the far right and establishment liberals. Liberals hate leftists because the psychological discomfort known as cognitive dissonance actually hurts. So those who provoke it can often be perceived as the cause of that pain. Liberals hate leftists because they've spent their whole lives building and reinforcing a worldview which validates war, oligarchy, and exploitation, while thinking of themselves as defenders of equality and sanity. So when someone comes in promoting an ideology which highlights the discrepancy between those 2 points, the cognitive dissonance which sets in makes them feel like the leftists just slapped them in the face. Liberals hate leftists because while both purport to support the working class and disempowered groups, only one of them actually does so. Liberals hate leftists for the same reason someone telling a bogus self-aggrandizing story at a party would hate somebody who caught them in one of their lies in front of everyone. Liberals hate leftists because leftists are a constant reminder that liberals are not the thing they pretend to be. Liberals hate leftists for the same reason you'd hate someone who keeps yelling out, This is all fake. These are actors at a theater. They disrupt a pleasant illusion the liberals are trying to enjoy about villains being fought by heroic protagonists. Liberals hate leftists for the same reason a wife who is informed that her husband is cheating on her will often turn her anger upon the person who told her. They made it hard to hold on to the delusion that their setup is working out fine. Liberals hate leftists because a worldview that is based on lies will always necessarily be opposed to a worldview that is based on truth. Liberals hate leftists because your worldview feels like a part of who you are. So people who expose the hypocrisy, ineffectiveness, illegitimacy, and untruthfulness of your worldview will often be perceived as if they are attacking you personally. Liberals hate leftists because they are surrounded by screens telling them all day, every day, that their ideology is the only correct position. So people who come in pointing out the flaws in their ideology will be perceived not as individuals with whom they disagree, but as liars. Liberals hate leftists because they've been trained by the mass media over the last few years to view any disagreement with the imperialist Beltway consensus on foreign policy as Russian and therefore sinister. Liberals hate leftists because change is scary and status quo bias is a thing. Liberals hate leftists because if the leftists are right, then everyone who taught them everything they know in life is wrong. Liberals hate leftists because it's easier than tearing down your entire worldview and rebuilding it piece by piece from the perspective that everything you've been told about the world and the way it works is a lie. Liberals hate leftists because despite whatever stories they might believe about themselves, liberals are opposed to everything leftists stand for in every meaningful way. The more real leftists are with themselves about this, the more effective they will be. Some of my dear viewers and listeners have expressed recently that they've suffered some cognitive dissonance and they've had difficulty rebuilding their worldview piece by piece. It is difficult to come to grips with the realization that everything you've been told about the world and the way it works is a lie. But not only do we have to come to grips with it, dear viewers and listeners, we have to spread the word and we have to educate everyone we know and everyone we don't yet know that this is the way we need to begin to think. There's a lot at stake here, and there isn't much time left.